He thought inviting her onto the stage would give the crowd a laugh, but before the night was over, the world-famous Victor Langford would learn that arrogance can sound far louder than any piano. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The Grand Regent Ballroom in Manhattan glowed beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most family homes. Marble floors reflected soft gold light. Waiters moved like shadows, carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in elegant evening gowns filled the room with practiced laughter and polished smiles. At the center of it all stood a 9-foot concert grand piano, black as midnight, shining beneath a single white spotlight. Tonight belonged to Victor Langford. At 46, Victor was more than a pianist. He was a phenomenon. Critics called him the last true genius of classical music. His sold-out performances stretched from New York to Vienna to Tokyo. His recordings topped charts few classical artists ever touched. But fame had hardened him. Years of applause had convinced him that talent and importance were the same thing. As Victor stepped onto the stage in a custom navy tuxedo, the room rose in thunderous applause. He accepted it with a slight bow, chin lifted just enough to remind everyone who they had paid to see. Then he sat, cracked his knuckles once, and began to play. The opening notes rolled through the ballroom like silk over glass. Fast runs climbed like fire. Heavy chords landed with authority. Guests closed their eyes. Some reached for each other's hands. For 20 minutes, Victor controlled the room completely. Then, during the standing ovation, his eyes drifted past the front tables, past the diamond necklaces and expensive watches, all the way to the final row near the service entrance. There she sat, a woman alone in a plain cream cardigan, simple brown skirt, and worn shoes that had seen better winters. Her hair was pinned back neatly. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She wasn't clapping wildly like the others. She was simply watching. Victor's smile thinned. To a man who fed on admiration, calmness felt like disrespect. He leaned toward the microphone. It seems we have a serious critic in the back tonight. Laughter scattered across the room. Heads turned. The woman blinked once, then lowered her eyes. Victor pointed casually. You, ma'am. Yes, you. Since you look so unimpressed, perhaps you'd like to show us how it's done. More laughter now, louder and easier. A few people twisted in their chairs to get a better look at her embarrassment. The woman slowly stood. She was around 39, slender, composed, with a face that carried both grace and exhaustion. I'm fine where I am, she said softly. Victor spread his arms theatrically. Nonsense. Music belongs to everyone. Come, give us a few notes. The host chuckled into his microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, a surprise guest performance. Cameras lifted. Phones appeared. Somewhere near the bar, someone whistled. The woman glanced toward the exit only a few feet away. She could have left. Instead, she looked at the piano. For the briefest second, something old and distant passed through her eyes, like a memory stepping out of fog. Then she began walking forward. Her shoes tapped gently against the marble floor. The laughter faded one row at a time. Victor stepped aside with a smug grin, certain the next 60 seconds would be harmless entertainment. He had no idea the woman approaching him was Clara Bennett, and that before the night ended, every person in that ballroom would remember exactly where they were when she touched the keys. Clara Bennett reached the stage without hurrying, without lowering her head, and without giving the room the reaction it wanted. The final few laughs died in the air as she stepped into the white spotlight. Up close, the contrast between her and the ballroom became even sharper. Victor Langford stood polished and expensive, every line of his tuxedo precise, every strand of silvered hair in place. Clara looked like someone who had wandered in from a long shift and taken the wrong elevator. Yet there was something in the stillness of her posture that did not belong to ordinary discomfort. Victor noticed it, though he could not name it. He gestured grandly toward the bench. Please, he said, his smile sharpened by vanity. Play anything you like. Something simple, perhaps. A few guests chuckled again. Clara looked at the keyboard, then at Victor. Are you certain? She asked. Her voice was soft, but it carried farther than expected. Victor spread his hands to the audience. I insist. The host laughed nervously, sensing a shift he did not understand. Clara sat on the bench and adjusted it by less than an inch. That tiny movement caught the attention of two violinists from the house quartet seated near the front. Professionals notice habits others miss. Amateurs drop into a piano bench carelessly. Trained musicians set distance by instinct. One of them leaned forward. Clara rested her fingertips above the keys, but did not touch them. Her eyes closed. The ballroom, so eager a moment ago, grew strangely patient. Waiters stopped mid-step. Even the clink of glasses disappeared. Victor folded his arms, prepared to enjoy the awkwardness. Then Clara opened her eyes and quietly asked, "Has this instrument been tuned today?" Several heads turned. The piano technician, standing near the side curtain, straightened in surprise. Victor frowned. "This piano is maintained before every performance." Clara nodded once. "The upper register is slightly bright, but it will do." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor's jaw tightened. She placed both hands on the keys and played a single chord. It rang clean and warm through the ballroom. Then another. Then a descending phrase so delicate it felt less like music and more like memory. Guests who had already begun reaching for their phones slowly lowered them again. Clara was not searching for notes. She was greeting the instrument. Victor's expression lost a trace of color. She moved into a short prelude, effortless and controlled, her left hand shaping velvet shadows while the right hand floated above them. Like candlelight. The sound was intimate, impossible in a room built for spectacle. A woman near the front pressed her hand to her chest. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" Clara ended the phrase gently and lifted her hands. The silence afterward was heavier than applause. She turned toward Victor. "Would you prefer something simple?" she asked, "or something honest?" A few guests exchanged startled looks. Victor forced a smile that no longer reached his eyes. "By all means," he replied, "surprise us." Clara looked back at the keyboard. Her fingers hovered once more, but this time there was no hesitation, only decision. She began with 8 notes, so quiet they made people lean forward to hear. Then the melody opened like sunrise over water. The house quartet violinist suddenly stood up. "No," he whispered to himself. "That is impossible," because he recognized the piece. It was a lost arrangement of Rachmaninoff, rumored among elite pianists, feared for its brutal difficulty, and almost never performed in public. Victor Langford had once claimed in an interview that only 3 living artists could play it properly. Clara Bennett had just chosen it without sheet music. Across the ballroom, faces turned from admiration to disbelief. Victor slowly unfolded his arms. For the first time that night, the famous man on stage looked exactly like everyone else. The first cascade of notes swept through the ballroom like a cold wind through an open cathedral. Conversations ended mid-breath. Smiles froze where they sat. Clara Bennett did not attack the keyboard the way lesser performers attacked difficult music. She seemed to release it, allowing each phrase to arrive exactly when it wished. Her wrists stayed loose, her shoulders calm, her face almost serene. Yet beneath that stillness, impossible complexity unfolded. The left hand drove thunder across the lower keys, while the right hand spun silver threads over the top register. It was power without strain, precision without vanity. Victor Langford stared at her hands as though they belonged to someone breaking the laws he had built his life around. He knew the piece intimately. Years earlier, he had attempted it in Berlin and abandoned it after rehearsal, blaming the hall acoustics. Critics never knew the truth. He had not been able to control it. Clara was not merely controlling it. She was revealing it. Near the front table, a retired conductor named Harold Mercer slowly removed his glasses. "Listen to the voicing," he whispered to the woman beside him. "She is rewriting the room." The woman nodded, tears already gathering in her eyes. Clara moved into the second movement with such tenderness that the chandeliers themselves seemed too loud for the moment. A young server carrying a tray stopped beside a marble column and forgot entirely why he was there. 2 finance executives who had spent the evening checking their phones now sat motionless, eyes fixed on the stage. Even the hotel staff near the service doors leaned in. Music had dissolved rank, price, title, and pretense. It left only listeners. Victor tried to recover his posture. He straightened his jacket and lifted his chin, but confidence is difficult to fake when truth is happening 5 feet away. He stepped toward the host, and whispered sharply, "Cut the lights after this section." The host did not move. He was staring too. Clara reached a passage famous for destroying tempo in lesser hands, a storm of leaping octaves and cross rhythms that made audiences clap simply because they knew survival itself was an achievement. She did something worse to Victor than surviving. She made it beautiful. The phrase rose, broke, and returned transformed, each note placed with the certainty of someone who had once lived inside the composer's mind. Gasps moved through the crowd. Harold Mercer stood to his feet first. Then another guest. Then another. Not applause yet. Instinct. People rising because they felt history entering the room and did not wish to meet it sitting down. Victor's mouth parted slightly. He had spent decades chasing standing ovations. Clara was receiving one before the final movement had even begun. Then she stopped. Her hands hovered above the keys. The sudden silence hit the ballroom harder than sound. Victor blinked, confused. Clara looked down at the keyboard, then toward the piano technician near the curtain. "Pedal resonance is sticking," she said calmly. "Third dampener from the left." The technician rushed forward, checked beneath the instrument, then looked up pale. "She is right." Murmurs erupted. No casual player could have heard that flaw inside a room this large, inside a performance this demanding. Victor felt heat rise behind his collar. Clara waited patiently while the adjustment was made. She did not enjoy humiliating him. That was what made it complete. When the technician stepped back, she gave him a grateful nod and returned her fingers to the keys. Victor forced a brittle smile and addressed the audience. "A lucky guess," he said too loudly. Several guests turned toward him with open annoyance. Clara did not look at him. She began the final movement with a single low note so deep and certain it sounded like judgment. And in that moment, the most famous man in the room understood something he had never needed to learn before. Applause can be purchased with reputation. Silence must be earned. The final movement gathered itself like a storm over open water. Clara Bennett's hands moved with calm authority, never wasted, never theatrical, every motion serving the music rather than herself. That was the first difference everyone could feel. Victor Langford had always played as if the audience were lucky to witness him. Clara played as if the audience deserved something true. The low note she had struck grew into a relentless pulse, then climbed into a blaze of chords that rolled across the ballroom's ceiling and returned brighter than before. Crystal chandeliers trembled faintly. Glasses on distant tables hummed against polished wood. Guests who knew nothing about classical music felt their skin rise with goosebumps and could not explain why. Those who did know music looked almost frightened. Harold Mercer gripped the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles whitened. "This is interpretation at the highest level," he whispered. "No. Higher. This is confession." Clara drove into the most feared sequence of the arrangement, a run of blistering leaps and mirrored patterns designed to punish even elite performers. Victor had once told a magazine interviewer that the passage separated artists from imitators. Clara crossed it with such grace that the room barely noticed the danger until it was gone. She did not conquer the notes. She invited them to follow her. A woman near the center table began to cry openly. Her husband, embarrassed at first, soon found tears in his own eyes. Near the rear doors, the young server still held his tray untouched, unable to look away. Victor tried one last time to reclaim control. He stepped toward the microphone and forced a laugh. "Quite dramatic," he said. No one answered. No one even turned. The insult landed nowhere because the room no longer belonged to him. Clara entered the closing cadenza alone, a section without safety, without accompaniment, without anywhere to hide. Here the performer stands exposed. Vanity cannot survive there. Reputation cannot help. Only truth remains. Her fingers slowed, then traced a melody so intimate and fragile that several guests instinctively held their breath to avoid disturbing it. In those notes was youth, loss, distance, and the quiet endurance of years no one had applauded. Victor's face changed as he listened. The smugness drained first, then irritation, then the final defense of proud men everywhere, disbelief. He looked at Clara as if trying to remember where he had seen her before. The answer hovered just beyond reach. Clara rose from the tenderness into a final ascent of blazing octaves that rang like bells over a city at dawn. Then came the last chord, vast and certain, sustained just long enough to silence every thought in the room. She lifted her hands. No one moved. No one coughed. No one reached for a phone. The silence after greatness is different from ordinary quiet. It feels almost sacred. Then somewhere near the VIP tables, an elderly woman stood abruptly, one hand pressed to her mouth. Her silver opera gloves trembled. "Clara Rose Bennett," she said, voice breaking. "My God." Clara Rose Bennett. Heads turned. The woman stepped forward, tears shining beneath the chandeliers. She won the Vienna International at 22. She disappeared before the final tour. Every conservatory in Europe searched for her. The room erupted in astonished murmurs. Harold Mercer stared, then nodded slowly. "I knew it," he said. "I knew no unknown woman could play like that." Victor stumbled back half a step. He remembered now. A magazine cover from years ago. The young American prodigy critics said might redefine piano itself. Clara Bennett had vanished after her mother fell ill. Rumors followed, then silence. And he had invited her on stage for amusement. Cameras lifted again, but for an entirely different reason. Clara stood from the bench with no triumph in her face, only composure. She turned toward Victor, who suddenly seemed smaller than the tuxedo he wore. The famous man opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For once in his celebrated life, words could not save him. Victor Langford stood beneath the spotlight that had always obeyed him, yet now it seemed to expose rather than honor. Clara Bennett faced him with quiet patience, her hands resting lightly at her sides, the same hands that had just undone years of carefully polished arrogance. Around them, the ballroom buzzed with disbelief. Guests whispered names, dates, old headlines, forgotten interviews. Phones filled with searches. Faces once amused by Clara's plain cardigan now held the uneasy look people wear when they realized they judged too quickly. Victor finally found his voice. "Clara," he said, forcing familiarity he had not earned. "Had I known who you were, I would have introduced you properly." The sentence drifted into the room like cheap perfume. Clara regarded him steadily. "That is exactly the problem," she replied. No anger. No raised tone. Somehow that made it land harder. A few guests lowered their eyes. Victor gave a strained laugh. "Surely we can appreciate a playful misunderstanding." No one joined him. The host stepped backward, suddenly fascinated by the curtains. Harold Mercer folded his arms and said loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Humiliation is only playful to the person causing it." The room answered with murmurs of agreement. Victor's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to applause arriving faster than criticism. Clara turned toward the audience instead of toward him. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone," she said. "I came because there was an empty seat in the back and music on the program." Her words were simple, but they carried across marble and crystal with the weight of honesty. The elderly woman from the VIP table stepped closer, still emotional. "We thought you were gone forever," she said. Clara smiled gently. "No, I was just somewhere no cameras cared to look." The room fell silent again. She continued, "My mother became ill. Then life became expensive. Then ordinary. I taught children after school. I accompanied church choirs. I played nursing homes where half the audience slept and the other half sang louder than I did. Soft laughter broke through tears. And when there was time, I played for myself." Victor looked as if each sentence removed another layer of armor. "You abandoned the greatest career of your generation," he said, unable to hide his disbelief. Clara turned back to him. "No," she answered. "I chose people over prestige." Even the waiters stopped moving. Some truths do not need decoration. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in decades, talent was not enough to protect him from character. A woman at the center table began clapping slowly. Then another joined. Then another. Within seconds the ballroom thundered with applause, not the polished applause given to celebrities, but the raw kind offered when people recognize something rare and deeply human. Clara did not bow. She simply nodded once in gratitude. The hotel manager hurried forward, eager now that history had changed sides. "Miss Bennett, please allow us to host you for a return performance next month. We would be honored." Clara smiled politely. "Thank you, but I teach piano on Tuesday nights. My students have recital practice." Several guests laughed warmly. One man near the bar wiped his eyes and said, "That might be the most impressive sentence I have heard all year." Victor stepped aside from the piano, instinctively surrendering the center of the stage. Clara noticed and walked toward the exit instead. "You are leaving?" he asked, voice smaller than before. She paused near the edge of the spotlight. Yes, she said. Music was never meant to prove who is greater. It was meant to remind us what greatness sounds like. Then she continued across the marble floor in worn shoes that now seemed more dignified than every polished shoe in the room. People parted for her without being asked. Victor remained beside the grand piano, surrounded by chandeliers, fame, and silence. And that night, everyone in the Grand Regent Ballroom learned that applause can make a person famous, but humility is what makes them worthy. By the time the ballroom doors closed behind Clara Bennett, the atmosphere inside had changed in a way no decorator, donor, or celebrity performance could have created. The Grand Regent still glittered beneath chandeliers, the marbles still shined, the tuxedos still fit, but something less visible had cracked. People who arrived expecting entertainment now found themselves examining their own reflections in polished silver trays and dark window glass. Conversations no longer centered on investment portfolios, summer homes, or social calendars. They centered on one uncomfortable question. How often had they mistaken simplicity for insignificance? Victor Langford remained near the grand piano long after Clara disappeared into the Manhattan night. A few loyal admirers approached him with uncertain smiles, offering compliments that sounded more like sympathy. He thanked them mechanically. For years he had known exactly how to stand after a performance, where to look, how long to pause before accepting applause. Tonight, none of those instincts helped him. Harold Mercer passed by on his way to the coat check and stopped only long enough to say, "Talent may open doors, Victor. Character decides who stays welcome." Then he walked on. Victor did not answer. Across the room, the elderly patron who had recognized Clara spoke with the hotel manager. "Do you know where she went?" the manager asked eagerly. "No," the woman replied. "That is why she remains remarkable." Outside, cold air moved through the avenue in soft gusts. Clara walked 3 blocks to the subway station, carrying no trophy, no flowers, no assistant trailing behind her. Her cream cardigan shielded little from the chill, but her pace was steady. She descended the stairs, bought a modest fare card, and waited beside nurses, students, delivery workers, and a father calming a sleepy child. None of them knew they stood beside the woman the city would be discussing by sunrise. Clara seemed perfectly content with that. The next morning, clips from the ballroom flooded the internet. Guests had filmed the performance, the recognition, Victor's silence, Clara's final words. News anchors called it the most unexpected musical moment of the year. Commentators debated whether Victor's career could recover. Some defended him. Most did not. But the public fascination did not center on his fall. It centered on her refusal to chase the spotlight that had suddenly returned. Producers offered television interviews. Concert halls offered 7-figure contracts. Agents left messages through every contact they could trace. None were answered. 3 nights later, in a modest community center on West 72nd Street, 12 folding chairs surrounded an upright piano with chipped ivory keys. Children ages 8 to 14 waited with sheet music and nervous smiles. Clara entered carrying a canvas tote bag full of pencils, apples, and handwritten exercises. "Sorry I am late," she said. "The train was delayed." One student raised his hand immediately. "Miss Bennett, my dad said you are famous now." Clara set down the bag and smiled. "Then your dad should practice less gossip and more scales." The room burst into laughter. She spent the next 2 hours correcting posture, praising effort, slowing tempos, and showing a shy 10-year-old how to trust the left hand. There were no chandeliers, no cameras, no designer gowns. Yet when the children played together at the end of class, Clara smiled more warmly than she ever had in the ballroom. Meanwhile, Victor canceled 2 upcoming appearances. Reporters called it exhaustion. Those who knew him better understood it was something rarer. Reflection. Weeks later, a handwritten note arrived at the community center addressed to Clara. Inside were only 2 sentences. "I confused admiration with worth. Thank you for correcting me." No signature was needed. Clara folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and began the next lesson on time. And in a city that often measured people by noise, money, and name recognition, the quietest woman in the room had become the clearest voice of all. Autumn settled over Manhattan with a cleaner light and sharper mornings. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since the night Clara Bennett walked out of the Grand Regent Ballroom and left an entire city reconsidering itself. The headlines had cooled, as headlines always do. New scandals replaced old ones. New stars rose. New opinions shouted for attention. But in certain circles, the story refused to fade. Musicians still replayed the footage frame by frame. Teachers assigned it in ethics classes. Parents showed it to teenagers whenever vanity began sounding like confidence. And every Tuesday night, in a modest community center on West 72nd Street, Clara arrived 10 minutes early with sheet music tucked beneath one arm. She never mentioned the ballroom unless asked directly, and even then she answered with the brevity of someone discussing weather. It was an unusual evening, she would say. Then she would ask a student to begin again from measure 12. Her class had grown from 12 children to 28. Folding chairs no longer fit the room. Parents stood along the back wall. Some families traveled from Queens, Brooklyn, and northern New Jersey after hearing rumors that one of the greatest living pianists taught for almost nothing and accepted payment in whatever people could manage. Sometimes that meant cash. Sometimes homemade cookies. Sometimes nothing at all. Clara treated each the same. One Tuesday, a shy 11-year-old named Maya froze midway through a simple sonatina and burst into embarrassed tears. Before her mother could rush forward, Clara knelt beside the bench and said quietly, "Do you know how many wrong notes I have played in my life?" Maya sniffled and shook her head. Clara smiled. "Enough to build a bridge to California." Laughter warmed the room. "Now let us use 3 more and keep going." Maya played the piece through to the end. The applause she received was small, genuine, and life-changing. Across town, Victor Langford was living inside a different kind of silence. He had resumed performing, but audiences listened differently now. They no longer came only to admire his brilliance. They came to see whether humility had found him. Critics noted subtle changes. He bowed deeper. He spoke less. He thanked stagehands by name. During one recital at Carnegie Hall, he stopped midway to restart a movement after admitting he had rushed the tempo. Years earlier, he would have blamed acoustics, humidity, or a distracted audience. Now he simply said, "The fault was mine." The room responded with unexpected respect. Pride can command attention. Accountability earns something stronger. Then one rainy Thursday evening, Victor appeared at the community center carrying no entourage, no press, and no designer overcoat. He wore a plain charcoal jacket and held a cardboard box. Parents whispered instantly. Children stared. Clara looked up from organizing music books and said only, "You are blocking the doorway." A few parents laughed nervously. Victor stepped inside and set the box on a table. Inside were brand new metronomes, beginner keyboards, manuscript paper, and repaired pedal kits for aging pianos. "I was told your waiting list is longer than your budget," he said. Clara studied him for a moment. "Who told you that?" "The receptionist downstairs," he answered. "She is very direct." Even Clara smiled at that. Victor glanced around the room of children and folding chairs. "May I help?" Clara handed him a stack of lesson books. "Alphabetize these by composer and do not create drama." For the next hour, the once untouchable celebrity sorted sheet music, tightened bench screws, and listened as 8-year-olds stumbled through scales. One little boy tugged his sleeve and asked, "Are you famous?" Victor looked across the room at Clara helping Maya with hand position. Then he answered, "Not in the way that matters." The room went quiet for a heartbeat, then returned to cheerful noise. Clara said nothing, but she slid a second stack of books toward him. In her language, that was acceptance. And so the man who once used a stage to belittle a stranger found himself in a basement classroom. Learning the first lesson greatness had denied him for years. Talent fills concert halls. Service fills the soul. Winter arrived early that year, coating Manhattan sidewalks with a thin silver frost and sending people hurrying through the streets with collars raised and coffee cups clutched close. Inside the community center on West 72nd Street, warmth came from older radiators, bright fluorescent lights, and the nervous energy of children preparing for their first public recital. Clara Bennett stood near the upright piano with a clipboard in hand, calm as ever, while 28 students adjusted sweaters, straightened sheet music, and whispered to one another. On the bulletin board behind them hung a hand-lettered sign that read Winter Music Evening. No sponsor logos. No luxury branding. No velvet ropes. Yet every folding chair in the room had been claimed 30 minutes before the doors officially opened. Parents lined the walls. Grandparents stood 2 rows deep near the back. Neighbors who had heard stories from the building's superintendent squeezed beside strangers. Even Harold Mercer arrived early and insisted on sitting in the last row because, as he put it, real music sounds best when it has traveled through ordinary air. Victor Langford entered quietly carrying 2 trays of hot chocolate and a toolbox. No one gasped anymore when they saw him there. That novelty had passed weeks ago. The children simply waved and called him Mr. Victor. He preferred it. He wore a plain wool coat and snow-damp boots, and before removing either, he crouched beside a loose chair leg and tightened it without being asked. Clara glanced at him and said, "You are late by 3 minutes." Victor checked his watch. The subway stalled. "Excuses age poorly," she replied. Several parents laughed. He smiled and took his place near the back wall distributing cups. The recital began with halting scales, brave mistakes, forgotten rests, and the kind of applause only families know how to give. Clara celebrated each student the same way whether they played 1 page or 5. Good recovery. Excellent listening. That final phrase had courage. Confidence grew measure by measure. Then Maya, the 11-year-old who once cried halfway through a sonatina, walked to the piano in a blue cardigan and trembling shoes. She sat, breathed exactly as Clara had taught her, and began. The room became still. Her tone was not flawless, but it was honest. Her phrasing carried patience. By the final cadence, even the radiator seemed to soften its clanking in respect. When she finished, the applause shook the folding chairs. Maya looked for Clara first, then smiled through tears. Clara nodded once, proud and steady. Midway through the evening, a city arts commissioner slipped through the back door with 2 assistants. Word of Clara's classes had reached offices where culture was often discussed more than practiced. The commissioner watched 3 performances, then approached during intermission. "Miss Bennett," she said, extending a hand. "The city would like to fund a permanent youth music program under your direction. Dedicated space, instruments, staff, full salary, whatever you require." Parents turned to listen. Victor looked down, already smiling because he knew what was coming. Clara considered the offer seriously, which made everyone wait even harder. "I will accept on one condition," she said. "No child is turned away for money, address, accent, clothes, or lack of experience." The commissioner nodded immediately. "Done," Clara added, "and no gala dinners to celebrate helping children." Laughter rolled through the room. "Also done," the commissioner said. News spread fast. By the end of the week, local papers called it the Bennett Initiative. Clara ignored the name and spent her time measuring rooms for pianos. Victor donated proceeds from 2 sold-out concerts without publicity. When reporters praised his generosity, he answered, "I am repaying a debt." On the final night before winter break, Clara locked the classroom and stepped into softly falling snow. Victor waited by the curb beside a modest sedan. "Need a ride?" he asked. Clara looked at the snow, then at him. "Only if you drive as humbly as you now perform." He opened the passenger door with exaggerated seriousness. She almost laughed. As they pulled away from the curb, lights glowing behind them, the city seemed a little kinder than it had been before 2 strangers met at a piano. And sometimes that is how real change begins. Not with speeches, but with one person choosing dignity when mockery would have been easier. Spring returned to Manhattan with a gentler light and the quiet confidence of a city that had survived another winter. The Bennett Initiative opened its doors in a renovated building just 2 blocks from the original community center, with polished but unpretentious practice rooms, rows of upright pianos tuned weekly, and a recital hall that seated 100 without a single velvet rope in sight. On the first morning, children lined the hallway clutching backpacks and sheet music, some wearing pressed shirts, others wearing sneakers that had seen better days, all carrying the same mix of excitement and doubt. Clara Bennett walked through the space without ceremony, adjusting a bench here, straightening a stack of manuscript paper there, pausing to greet each student by name as if the building had always belonged to them. Victor Langford arrived early with a crate of metronomes and a thermos of coffee, placing both on a long table before checking the pedals in Studio B. He worked quietly, and when a parent recognized him and began to introduce him to others, he raised a hand with a small smile and said, "Today is not about me." The day unfolded in simple, meaningful rhythms. Scales in one room, sight reading in another, laughter spilling into the hallway when a beginner struck a confident wrong note and kept going anyway. Clara moved from class to class, correcting posture, shaping phrases, reminding students that listening mattered as much as playing. At noon, she gathered everyone in the recital hall and asked a single question. Why do we play? Hands shot up with answers about trophies, auditions, college, and applause. Clara nodded, then said, "Those things may come, but they are not the reason. We play to tell the truth, even when no one is watching." The room settled into a deeper kind of attention. That evening, the first official concert of the initiative filled every seat. There were no cameras, no sponsors, no reserved rows. Parents sat beside neighbors, donors beside delivery drivers, Harold Mercer beside a young couple who had never attended a concert before. Victor took a seat in the back, just as he had learned. Clara introduced the program without flourish and invited the students to begin. Piece by piece, the music revealed growth that had nothing to do with perfection. A hesitant child found courage in the middle section of a simple piece. A teenager who once rushed learned to breathe and let a melody unfold. Maya closed the program with a performance that carried both discipline and joy, and when she finished, the applause rose not in a wave of obligation, but in a shared recognition of effort turned into expression. After the final bow, a familiar hush lingered, the kind that follows something honest. Clara stepped forward and looked out at the audience, not to be admired, but to acknowledge them. "Thank you for listening," she said. Victor felt the words land differently now. Listening had become his work as much as playing. As the crowd began to disperse, a man in an expensive suit approached Clara and offered to endow a named hall in her honor. She thanked him and suggested he sponsor instrument repairs for families who could not afford them. He agreed without hesitation. Across the room, a young boy tugged at Victor's sleeve and asked if he would hear his scales. Victor knelt, counted him in, and listened as if the exercise were a concerto. When the last note sounded, he nodded and said, "Again, but this time, let the second measure breathe." The boy tried, improved, and beamed. Outside, the evening air carried the faint sound of traffic and distant laughter. Clara locked the front doors and stepped onto the sidewalk. Victor joined her, hands in his coat pockets, posture easy in a way it had never been before. "Full house," he said. Clara glanced back at the lit windows where students still waved to their parents. "Full hearts," she corrected. They stood for a moment in the soft glow of the streetlights, two people who had met in a room built for spectacle and chosen something quieter and more enduring. The city moved around them, in